we also have, I hope, Sally Wainwright, who is going to talk to Lucy Hunter Blackburn. So they're going to talk about the situation in Scotland. Lucy is involved in or maybe the major force behind MurrayBlackburnMackenzie, an Edinburgh-based policy analysis, or one of the forces. I'll hand over to Sally and Lucy to hear from you about Scotland.
I think that some women here might not know really that Scotland's heading in the same direction as Canada. And then in the last month, there's been sort of three fairly major events taking place in Scotland. There's been 2 court cases and a new piece of legislation introduced, which all have a significant impact on women's rights. But before we kind of talk about them in any detail, I wondered, Lucy, if you could say a bit about the background and the kind of general atmosphere and environment in Scotland for women, and you know, what just the general sort of sense of what's going on there, because that's the only way to make sense, I think, of the more recent kind of events.
So Scotland has, we're part of the United Kingdom still, and the main legislation that governs equality rights, protection of women's rights, is a UK level legislation. So in UK law, sex is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, and also protected as separately is what's called gender reassignment. So people who are covered by that means that the kind of protections against not being served in a shop, or the obvious basic, not being discriminated against at work. So unlike, say, bits of the US, we have 2 different separate legal protections, and they function UK-wide, and they belong, and all that legislation can only be changed at the level of the Parliament in London. In Scotland, we have a separate devolved Parliament, and that has certain powers, and one of the powers it has, which it's never previously used and it's about to try and use, is to change the way in which people can change their sex in law effectively for legal purposes, the thing called the Gender Recognition Act. So again, at UK level, since 2004, we've had legislation which allows a very small, tightly defined group of people to change their birth certificates, but also to change their legal status for most purposes where sex matters. And the Scottish Parliament, that's a UK-wide piece of legislation. The Scottish Parliament wants to bring in new legislation that opens up that process to a much larger group based on self-declaration. So the background that this proposal has been rumbling around in Scotland now for 4 or 5 years. Over that time, women have become more and more organised, more and more up to speed, really, with the implications of all that. We've connected with people facing the same discussion in the rest of the UK. And the atmosphere has been, as it has everywhere where this comes up, it's never good. As is evident, we're part of an international position where whenever women want to talk about this stuff, we are demonized. I look forward to the next speaker. I'm sure we're going to all connect to a lot of what she's about to tell us. So the atmosphere has not been good at all. The women up here who've organised meetings, who are not myself and my colleagues, have been incredibly brave, but it's been hard, and we've had all the same stuff with demonstrations and vilification, including up to and inside our parliament.
Well, I was thinking also about sort of the political situation, because we've got a government which is not just kind of theoretically committed to this, but that seem almost hysterical about it. I mean, it's one of the kind of major factors that they think, pieces of legislation that they're wanting to concentrate on at the moment, when there's so much else going on both in the rest of the world and in Scotland that some of us might think would be better to have precedence, really. And how did we get to this point?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think we're all asking, how has this become the flagship piece of legislation for our government now? It is a really interesting question. I don't think I can answer that, to be honest. What we do know is that in Scotland, we have a government which is run by the Scottish National Party, who are a pro-independence party, who've been in power since 2007. They don't have a majority in the parliament, but they've constructed one by going into a semi-coalition with the Green Party here. And on this subject, the Green Party and the Scottish National Party both feel very strongly. Well, I say the Scottish National Party feels very strongly, but actually the truth of the matter is that the really strong drive for this is coming from the very top of the party. It isn't completely unanimous. There's dissent in all the parties, actually, I think, in Scotland, one way or another. But the reason this is coming forward so forcefully now is that the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, who characterised herself as a feminist to her fingertips, is fully signed up to this and has sort of identifies with this policy for reasons that, to be honest, we can all speculate about. But in the end, we have to live with the fact that's where we are. There's a huge political drive, and in government in Scotland, it has to be said, is very much her. We're very presidential, although we don't have a presidential system in practice in Scotland now. What the First Minister wants is what the government will do. If she doesn't want it, it won't happen. If she does want it, it will happen regardless. We don't have really a very functional system of sort of cabinet checks and balances. But we are beginning to see, which is interesting, on the backbenches of her party in the parliament, people beginning to find their voice, that they are not comfortable with the way this is being driven through. So, but that's very unusual. This is very rare to find a topic where her backbenchers are willing to speak up. So in that sense, we're in different territory from usual.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because somebody was saying the other day that it's like the biggest subject for some people's emails and things. Yeah. Politicians are just being inundated with stuff, because I don't know, I get the impression that then they just thought that they could get away with this, and that women, because they captured all the major women's organizations, it never crossed their minds that women are organized enough that we can form literally dozens of grassroots organizations. I think they've been absolutely shocked and horrified to discover how many women's organizations have suddenly sprung up to fight this, yourself included. MBM's done such a brilliant job in terms of kind of analyzing the policy, and it's almost impossible for them to counteract what you're saying, because what you say is true. So I was wondering, in the last month, at the end of last month, there were two court cases. Well, they'd both been heard, but there were appeals against both of them that were, the judgments were issued within days of each other. And they were both about women's rights, and they came to slightly different conclusions. Well, very different conclusions. I wonder, do you want to explain a little bit about the cases and what they were and what they said?
Yeah, they're very important, because one of the ways that in the UK people are pushing back against what they found is a combination of sort of parliamentary political capture is the word that gets used. I think I'm going to use it. The sense that it's very hard to get yourself heard in government or in parliament. The last place that you're left with is courts, and in the courts things have been done. So in two cases that we've had, one actually connects with the previous speaker quite well. One, the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament passed legislation in 2018, which was a 50% minimum women on public boards. So public bodies, big public bodies that have a board, a trust, a group of people who oversee them. They said that half of those at least had to be women, but you'll guess what's coming next. And they built into that women could include self-identity, anyone who said they lived as a woman, which was not defined, as you can imagine, in the legislation, because it never can be when people try to. And probably the most active, the largest grassroots group that has grown up here in recent years is a group called For Women Scotland, totally volunteer run as usual, put up with all the usual criticisms that these groups get. Very bravely, they put everything on the line to take this case, to take the government to court and say that this law could not be passed under the Scottish devolution settlement. It was outside the powers of the Parliament to redefine woman in this context, in this very particular context, in this way, and they won. They lost their first hearing, and they took it up to the higher court, to the appeals courts, and they won at the appeal level. And the court decided, and this is hugely important for us, the court decided that the Scottish Parliament's powers here were limited by the definition of woman in the UK-wide Equality Act, and that was a biological decision. That sex in the Equality Act means biological females, and that's a really important finding, because we haven't had it codified, we haven't had a court hearing that pinned it down. It should hardly need pinning down, but of course we know it does. This case could still go up to a higher court. The Scottish government could appeal. It looks to me like a very tight judgment, hard to appeal, but we don't know. So it's not necessarily finished as a story, but it probably is. I won't tempt fate. And that was a good outcome, but it took fighting. It took real fighting, lots of money being raised. So that's the first case. The second case, which was lost, relates to the census. So we have, like many countries, a census every so often. Ours happens this year in Scotland, where you ask the entire population for demographic data. The Scottish government wants to do that census collecting data on sex as something which is self-identified. The government, the English and Welsh, the government for England and Wales wanted to do the same, and they lost a court case last year in England and Wales. They were told by the courts they had to use sex, meaning sex as in law, as in the Equality Act. They couldn't have self-identification. But up here, the government was also taken to court and it won the court case, and that can happen under the UK system. It's possible for that to happen. So we lost the court case on the census. Fair Play for Women, a UK-wide body, brought both of those cases. They lost the first one and they lost the appeal hearing. And the census has now started. So even if they were to take an appeal, which they could, it would be too late for the census. So they're still looking at whether they're going to appeal. For what it's worth, the government's case, I think, was terrible. I think, but going to court a third time costs money, takes risks. It's not a foregone conclusion. That's a good move. It's also worth saying, Sally, that although we lost the battle on the census, actually in that judgment there were wins. And the win again was that though this court said that in this context, in the context of the census, the government could use self-identification. It also said if sex appears in the piece of law generally and it affects rights or status, if it matters, basically, if sex appears in law where it matters in a way to people, it should be biological sex. That was a big win. It astonishes us that the census doesn't matter.
Yes, quite.
It astonishes us that anyone would think you'd put sex in law when it didn't matter, almost by definition. There's an old footballers might remember, people who are fond of football in Liverpool. There was a manager from Bill Shankly who was talking about a football rule where you're offside if you're interfering with play, and Bill Shankly's thing was, if you're not interfering with play, you shouldn't be on the pitch. And I sort of feel the same about sex in law. Sex in law, if sex is in law, it's there because it matters. But so we lost the battle, but we feel we won something as well in that case, which may be another reason that appeal may not proceed, because that may be more important to protect that. I don't know. That's the sort of judgments that Fair Play will have to think about.
It puts the Scottish census in a very strange position because it won't be comparable with the English and Welsh census, because that knows what sex is, well, more or less. That sex means that you're a proper male, whereas the Scottish census data will be anybody who chooses to tick the box that says they're female or male. So that's not comparable, and nor will it be any use for, I don't know, looking at equal pay gaps or any of those sorts of things, because we're not going to have any way of knowing who's a man and who's a woman now.
No, it's a serious loss. The English census will still allow people who've got a gender recognition certificate to tick female, but that's a tiny, tiny number of people. We know how many that is, and it's as a data person, I would have to say you couldn't plausibly say that the number of people with GRCs could mess up the data. It would be really hard to run that argument well. But once you go for self-ID, all bets are off. You have no idea. And as Sally, as you say, we will never have any idea how badly affected the data has been. And we worry that it'll affect young people, because we know these identities, trans identities, are much, much, much more common in younger age groups. And it will affect, and younger women particularly. The age range of people with trans identities is not even across the population. It's not even by sex. So we will lose women potentially. So it's not just who's going to be in the woman box who shouldn't. We're going to lose women who are going to tick men. It's very serious. We're out of harmony. To argue their case, the Scottish government had to drive a coach and horses through established harmonisation agreements at the UK level. I sat actually in court, a week and a half ago now, it feels like a lifetime, with other people, and we heard the case, and it was very painful to stand and hear the Scottish government talking, none of this stuff matters, sex. They actually argued that because the census question is in the present tense, what is your sex? That must mean, what is it today? Literally, the government lawyer stood up and outlined. It was like sitting through the Scopes monkey trial. I'm going to say it was that level. So it was very, very serious loss, and the census is now lost.
There are questions about your sex, which you can self-identify, asking whether you have a trans identity, and asks about your sexuality. And I reckon that if you ticked a box that said you were a male, and you tick the box that said trans, and you tick the box that said gay, you could be anything from a straight man who thinks he's a lesbian to a lesbian who identifies as a man and is choosing to fill it. So there's actually not even any way of making sense of it, which is what the government's been saying. Oh, well, we can just cross-reference them, but you can't, because you don't know which questions anybody's answering truthfully. So
you can't. If someone ticks non-binary, and just the most basic point, if you trick non-binary in the trans box, there's nothing to cross-reference with. That means, you can't begin to... Anyway, it is a problem. We have to work out where we go from here on that one.
But this brings us, so what we're seeing in the census, for example, and we've seen in all walks of life, in public and voluntary organizations, for example, is that even without self-ID being introduced in law, it's been happening on the ground virtually across the board. In a very frightening sort of way. And I think the census is one example of that. And we're seeing, men in women's prisons, we're seeing a man running a women's rape crisis center. So this is having very, very serious effects, even without legislation. And yet this week, the government introduced a piece of legislation which will allow people basically not just to self-ID, which seems to me they can do anyway, but to legally change their sex and get a gender recognition certificate just on their say-so. That literally they just have to go, I'm a man now, and that's it. And there they are, a man or whatever, a woman forever. So do you want to say something about that legislation and well, yes, just explain.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I suppose it is important to start with the position, the government position is that we've already got this legislation, and that is important. This is not new that people can change their birth certificates. What's new and different is the basis on which they can do so. So what you can, at the moment, in order to go through the process, the law requires you to have got a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and to be able to demonstrate that you've been living as if you were the other sex for at least 2 years, and that is put to a scrutiny panel who issue the certificates. Now, what is going to change is that instead in future you will just turn up in a lawyer's office, you will swear a solemn declaration that for the rest of your life you intend to live as the opposite sex, that you've been doing so for at least 3 months, and that's it. That is the system that they're planning. And they say the safeguards against any kind of abuse are that people won't do this because it will be a criminal offence to do it and not mean it. And that is the safeguard. That's the whole safeguard against abuse. It's quite amazing. So there are various things going on here. You can look at the background theory. This is self-declaration embedded in law. Once it's embedded in law, regardless of its immediate legal effect, it will become very hard to unpick, Sally, all the things that you've said, where things like hospital wards or whatever have moved on to self-declaration. But there's also technical questions about the fact you're going to have a much larger group of people who will have rights. The government is very fuzzy on what extra rights these certificates give to get into single-sex spaces. They keep saying they don't give any, but the UK government and other bodies do say they give them. So it's very confusing. So it's really that the key points that we make when we're arguing, trying to explain to members of Parliament and others why this matters, is that that yes, we have a law at the moment, but this new law, this change will make a much bigger group, a much more diverse group, a group potentially who have done far less to change how they live, gone through far less of a procedure. The law doesn't require you at the moment to have surgery, but nevertheless, that kind of that difference between having to say you've done it for 2 years, you've got a diagnosis, you're moving to a much bigger, diverse group, and that group, we think, will acquire new rights to enter single-sex spaces that they can defend in the courts if they are challenged. That's the key point. And that the government hasn't thought about both that generally, and also about the way in which the system is also separately open to abuse by people who just rock up and want to abuse it. The government incredibly naive and incredibly, what's I'm looking for, complacent about the scope for abuse, is our view. So that's where we are. The legislation was introduced into Parliament on Thursday, just 2 days ago, looking exactly the same as it did last time they ever consulted on it. They've listened to nothing. They have taken nothing on board they talk about having had 2 big consultations, but they have taken absolutely nothing on board from those of any seriousness. However, Sally, there is one good thing. Shall I talk about the good thing?
Please, let's have some good news.
There is a really good thing here, and I do want people to take this away. If you have been in this debate for any length of time, you will know that simply saying that asking questions about plans to bring in self-declaration is bigoted. There should be no debate. Any debate is questioning people's existence. All these very strong hyperbolic lines that we must not ask questions. In Thursday's debate, first of all, it's important to say that the minister had to stand up and give a statement to Parliament about what they were doing. But this is not normal. Normally, governments introduce a bill, they just slap down a piece of paper and it starts trundling through the system. She felt that she had to stand up and give a statement and answer questions. Now, that's important. That would not have happened. That was not the plan.
No, but it is a shame that it was full of fantasy.
No, but it was there, and
yes, it was.
This don't ever not notice what's been achieved. It's easy sometimes to see the huge mountain ahead, but we've come a way up. And if you think about how even 2.5 years ago, there was outside Hollywood, outside our Parliament, as part of Pride, there were a group of lesbians who stood up and protested against self-ID and self-identification of lesbianism, and they were thoroughly abused, and an MP, an MSP, stood giving a speech on a bus, and it actually, if you see the videos, it's actually frightening. Actually, it doesn't feel like normal politics at all. It spoke in a way that encouraged the abuse and of those women, and then on Thursday, MSPs from all parties, all of them stood up and said, yes, this is serious legislation and we must debate it and we must be allowed to debate it. And the minister, although I disagree very deeply with what she's trying to do in terms of how she's doing it, is she felt she had to say, everyone has to, we have to have a right to speak here. It's worth noticing, those of you who are in Scotland or in the UK who are used to watching how this goes, it's worth noticing that was not what you were seeing 2.5 years ago when this issue came up. We've now been told by all our parliamentarians that we're allowed to have views, we're allowed to put forward our views, we are not to be written off automatically as bad people, not allowed to participate in this as a democratic process. And I can't stress enough that it may not feel like a big win, and I'm not sure it should feel like a big win. It is one.